Oh, welcome. Welcome, everybody, to this podcast of sorts, Memory Wars, really how society confronts sin. My name is Bob Gillette, and I'm a member of the Holocaust Education Foundation of Central Virginia. We are very, very excited to have you here and to have our guests here as well. This NPR Radio IQ episode, Memory Wars, this podcast has become really hot in the podcast listening world. It has hit nerves of relevance. And we are recording tonight's event. So in truth, this is going to be a podcast of a podcast. So in a sense, what's happening is you are watching podcast you hear, but you're going to watch how this dialogue takes place. The reason that we're going to record, videotape, and tape it orally is that we want to have the flexibility of being able to use this in classrooms and in other sessions as well. So welcome to the podcast of the podcast. In a sense, this kind of layering, if you will, is a search for meaning. It's needed because the topics we will discuss are significant and they're very timely. Okay, let's get started. Mallory Noe-Payne is Radio IQ's Richmond reporter and bureau chief. She's also a rock climber. She is a Fulbright scholarship recipient. Michael Paul Williams is a veteran columnist with the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and he was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for distinguished commentary in 2021 for his work on the issue of monuments. It's interesting that just last week or so here at the Jones Library, there was a lecture on monuments. Should they stay? Should they go? So it's a very, very contemporary topic, if you will. Mallory, how did this project start? And also, why did you select Michael to come aboard in your process?
Because I begged her.
Because I wanted to say I had Pulitzer Prize winning Michael Paul Williams. So I'm curious, first and foremost, who has listened to the podcast? And I want you to be honest. It helps. Yeah, okay, great. Really cool. I'm not going to assume that anybody is coming to the table with all the background knowledge of the podcast. I started this journey 3 years ago, might be longer now at this point. I applied for a Fulbright fellowship, which gave the opportunity to go abroad to Germany specifically for a year for a journalist to work on a project. And that was the starting point. The starting point wasn't the idea. The starting point was the opportunity. And I had to ask myself, okay, well, what could a Richmond, Virginia reporter want to report on and learn about in Germany? And it just hit me upside the head. I had been covering Confederate monuments and the dialogue around Confederate monuments for years at that point. Contentious meetings, protests, counter-protests. And I don't know if you guys have been involved in any of these conversations, and it's something you've heard before or not, but Michael certainly had, which is there are no statues of Hitler in Germany. Right? It was a counterpoint. It was an argument that would come up. And I was like, was that even true? And I said, well, there you go. That's why I'm going to go to Germany and explore. And as it turned out, no, there are no statues of Hitler in Germany. But, boy, there's a lot more to learn. And it became a lot larger than a conversation about Confederate monuments. So that was the seed. That was the seed. And I had this fantastic opportunity to spend a year abroad and just explore this really fundamental question of what does a society do after the worst has happened? How do you build up from that? And as I was doing that research and reporting, and very early on, I knew that I needed another voice, a sounding board, someone back home in Richmond. And that's where Michael came in.
And I could not have been more excited. When I got the news that Mallory had gotten the Fulbright, I mean, I don't think I could have been happier or more thrilled than if I'd gotten it myself.
I bet you could have been.
Well, probably. And I remember interviewing her. So I got to write about this because this is a great thing. And I interviewed her, and it just that only reinforced the idea that, wow, this is just so awesome, and I want to like keep abreast of how this is going for her, and because it was just such a phenomenal idea and such an ingenious entryway into probing extremely problematic history from two separate angles. And so I was just elated when she asked me to be that sounding board.
Was this at the time that there was such turmoil in Richmond?
When has there ever not been? Well, okay, I ask you that question for real, because how long have you been writing about Richmond?
I've been journaling for 41 years and writing a column relative to Richmond for 31.
And when has there not been turmoil in Richmond?
Yeah, there's always drama. I hear there's drama here too. I'll be back. I'm a drama king.
But I think one of the things that we quickly realized is that I think that we challenged one another in a really productive way. We both grew up in Richmond. We're both from Richmond. But as we learned and discovered, if you've listened to the podcast, right, I grew up in white Richmond. My family is generations back in Richmond, right? Michael grew up in black Richmond. And then I also think we have this generational gap. Mm-hmm. That brings a lot to our discussions.
Yeah. I remember when her grandfather was coaching at Virginia Commonwealth University. So there you go.
Yeah.
So it was more than chemistry. It was, I mean, that's obvious, but it was also thematically that the two concerns meshed.
Yeah, I think we had the same
perspectives.
We have the same goal, right? We're coming to the table with slightly different perspectives, certainly different life experiences, and not always the same opinion, but the same goal.
If you listen to the podcast, and for those of you who haven't, highly recommend it.
You're going to recommend our podcast?
Yes. Mallory, and I knew this even before we produced the podcast, from her work as a journalist and just this idea itself. She's very thoughtful in a way that makes for stimulating engagement, both as a listener and as someone working with her on the podcast. So, I mean, I enjoy that sort of thing. I mean, I'm a columnist. I'm used to just kind of preaching to the audience and not getting terribly productive feedback in return, and sometimes quite vulgar. But, you know, this sort of give and take got me to exercise a different kind of brain as a journalist. And it was just really gratifying to do that, just to bounce ideas back and forth, perspectives back and forth, as we bounce these histories back and forth. So
this gives a little bit of the background of how these two work together, and you can see it's it is a chemistry, and it's a love affair. It's wonderful. But you went to Germany?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Enough about us,
Yep.
right? Let's talk about the project. Let's talk about what we did. So the podcast is 6 episodes long, and it covers a lot of material. But so for the purposes of our discussion tonight, I'm going to hone in on one story, which if you've listened to the whole podcast, maybe you'll hear some things you've heard before, but if you haven't, I'm really excited to bring it to you. And we're going to hone in on sort of one individual's story and the theme that emerges, which is about memorials and memorialization. The man that we're going to talk about, his name is Volker. I'm going to set it up a little bit. We're going to listen to some audio, but I'm going to start with some background. So Volker is German. He's part of this generation in Germany that they call the 68ers. And I kind of think of them as the baby boomers. They're individuals who were born after the war, whose parents lived through the war, and in many cases were Nazis, German soldiers. And they were raised and sort of known for questioning their parents, pushing back, asking, what did you do during the war? And so this was the generation that Volker was part of. He lived in Berlin in the 1990s after the fall of the Berlin Wall, reunification, and he and some friends decided to buy an apartment building. They went in together on a building in East Berlin. This was sort of common at the time, like West Berliners flooding into this new capitalist marketplace, buying up the property, right? And at the time, there was a process to purchasing property like this. There was a government agency whose job it was to approve the sale. And before the sale could be approved and the transaction cleared, they did historical research on the property and whether it had ever been confiscated by the Nazis, with the goal being of finding out if somebody Jewish had owned the property, if it had been stolen. And if it had been stolen, efforts were made to rectify the situation, to find the individual, to find their descendants, to give them the opportunity to have the property back. And so this was a common process at the time, which I sort of want that to sink in. That's a whole thing in and of itself we could talk about, right? So Volker
Sounds a lot like reparations.
So Volker and his friends bought this property, a big apartment building. They were aware that it was possible the transaction was not cleared. They waited, they found out all was clear. They were given the thumbs up, no problematic history, and they took ownership of the building. And that's how it was for years. They renovated it, they rented out the apartments. Volker and his family lived there for decades. And that's where we're going to start this clip. You're going to hear Volker's voice talking about what happened next. It's about 5 minutes long. You can close your eyes if you'd like. Volker told me that to know the facts about history is one thing, but to be aware of the presence of the past in your own life, well, that's another thing entirely. For him, that revelation came in 2017 when he found out that initial investigation into the building's history at the time of the sale, well, it didn't tell the full story. You learned that there had not been a Jewish owner, but did not think about tenants. When did it first occur to you?
The answer is very simple, by coincidence.
here's what happened. An old man showed up to the apartment building in Prenzlauer Berg, wandering the courtyard. At this point, Volker no longer lived there. He had moved to a different apartment nearby. But one of the building's current residents spoke to the old man, and the old man told him a story of having lived and grown up in this very building before the war. He wasn't Jewish, but he spoke of a childhood friend, a neighbor who was. The old man's memories were muddled and unclear, but he called the old friend Poldy. He talked about playing with Poldy and about how Poldy one day disappeared. When Volker and the other owners heard that story secondhand, it was the first time they had thought not just about possible Jewish owners, but also about residents.
From that moment on, we knew there were Jews living in our house.
The group immediately knew they had to learn more. Volker led the way in hiring a historian to do research.
Who lived in the house and who was persecuted and what happened with that person. Was he deported? Was he killed?
The historian came back with 6 names, including the name Leopold Jones, or Poldy for short. The historian learned that in the years of the war, Poldy wasn't a young child. He was a teenager, and he had been a member of an underground Jewish Zionist group who managed to evade the Gestapo for a while by hiding in Berlin. But eventually, Poldy was found.
And they almost beat him up to death, so he had to be taken to a hospital.
He was tortured.
And
interrogated to learn more about others in hiding.
they let him live to torture him.
But he never wavered. He didn't tell the Gestapo the names or locations of his friends.
And then he was put on the train to Auschwitz.
How old was he?
19. I mean, it was a young man, you know. He could be, even still be around. And he could have become anything.
Volker knew he couldn't atone. But doing nothing, just forgetting, that was never an option.
You have to take part in public affairs. And we don't want to live in a repressive society.
He says the choice to commemorate is ingrained into him.
This is our own interest. It feels very uncomfortable to live in a society where others are persecuted.
The word uncomfortable strikes me. Volker says it's uncomfortable to live in a society where others are persecuted. Not that it's uncomfortable to be reminded of that persecution.
To be uncomfortable is not a bad thing. It may be a necessary thing.
It's not a comfortable thing. But yes, absolutely. I think what's interesting about what Volker says and the way it flipped a switch in my brain is that he set up this dichotomy where you are uncomfortable either way. Right? Like the idea of avoiding the discomfort just isn't even in his worldview.
Mm-hmm.
To be uncomfortable is to be human. And I don't know for the life of me how we got to this absurd juncture in our existence where we are being told that to be uncomfortable is something unnatural. I saw a headline the other day out of St. Petersburg, Florida, where because of the complaint of one single parent, they were pulling the viewing of the film on Ruby Bridges. The first grader who desegregated that school in, I believe, Louisiana, if I'm not mistaken, long ago, because the parent of a second grader complained. So you have, in the parents' telling of it, because I don't think children really, I don't know if children think this way, but the parents' complaint is that a second grader cannot watch the lived experience of a first grader who dealt with all that hardship because it makes the second grader uncomfortable. And that to me is the height of absurdity, that a first grader had to live that life, but a second grader can't learn about it. But that's where we are. He says it's uncomfortable. What's the quote? It's uncomfortable to live
in a society where others are persecuted.
We seem like we're heading in the direction where it's uncomfortable for some folks not to have that persecution. And that's a slippery slope we don't want to go down because it gains momentum.
So here's where Folker's story goes. And it's why, I chose to share it. He found out the history of this building, and he set out to get memorials made. And I think with the crowd here today, a lot of times I say this and people have no idea what I'm talking about, but who has heard of a Stolperstein? Yeah, right? So these are, in German it translates to stumbling stone. They're like cobblestones with brass plaques on top, and each one is a memorial to a single person, a single victim of the Nazi regime. And it has their name and what information is known about when they were born and when and how they died. If they died, there are stones to survivors. And it's placed outside their last residence of choice, the last place they lived by choice, just on the street, the sidewalk in front of that house. And I had this incredible opportunity. If you listen to the full episode, you'll hear an interview with the artist who started this project. His name is Günter Dimnig. He's a lot like Folker. He's a German man of that same generation. And he's personally responsible for tens of thousands of stumbling stones across Europe.
Almost 90,000 now.
Almost 90,000. And he rolls up in this van and gets out. He's got an assistant now, but for a long time he didn't, right? And he gets down on his hands and knees and he starts chipping away and he places the stone in. And he began this project in the 90s, just like without asking permission in Berlin.
So this wasn't a policy of the government?
No. He had this idea, he had sort of bounced it off of some friends, and he had workshopped it, and he was like, I'm gonna try this out. And he, in the middle of the day, in Berlin, parked his car, got down on his hands and knees, and started tearing up the sidewalk and placed stones. And he told me no one batted an eye. No one stopped and asked him. He said one person stopped and asked what he was doing. And for months, no officials noticed. Until there was a construction site nearby, and the construction workers were like, wait, we can't dig this up. There's something here. And that's when Berlin officials first noticed. And so he started this project, and he's been doing it for years. And they're all over Europe. I saw them in Venice. And
His rationale for that.
Yeah.
It's somewhere in one of the podcasts, and if you listen to them enough, they start to blend together, and you don't quite remember where you heard it and so forth. But if I recall, in the back of his mind, there was the artist was a German Jew.
He's not Jewish.
He's not Jewish.
No.
But so that's why he quoted the Talmud, which was incorrect.
Because he didn't know.
He didn't know. Not found in the Talmud, but the quote is one that is relevant in Jewish intellectual history. And the quote is that motivated him, I think, and probably moved him along. A person is not forgotten until his or her name is forgotten. Wow.
And when you talk about school children, I wanted to bring this up because I saw Stolpersteine outside of primary schools, right? School children do projects where they research children who attended their school who were murdered. And I'm not saying that's easy, but I am questioning the motivation behind adults who don't want to make our children uncomfortable.
Does that sound almost incomprehensible to you, Michael?
Children learning that?
No.
What?
Well, yeah, in this country, yes.
My earliest real memory was of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So, I mean, my earliest memories are steeped in violence. And as children, we talked about what was going on all the time. We literally saw Lee Harvey Oswald murdered on television. I think children can handle more than we know or we think about the world around them. And I think our efforts to protect them at times can be somewhat destructive.
I wrote to Mallory, it's like a piece of literature. The layers of meaning keep popping up and going, we call it going into a rabbit hole, no, but going on and on and on. And there was one point I thought, she's really talking about, it was a German Jewish poet named Heinrich Heine. And in 1821, he was writing a play. And the quote in the play was, quote, "Where they burn books, so too will they in the end burn human beings." And I was thinking to myself, burning books and banning books, when a book is banned, in a sense, it's burned. And is it the less you know, the safer you are? The German perspective, it seems so different.
I'll tell you what, I'm not Jewish. The extent of my education on this topic before going to Germany was what every public school child in Virginia learns, which I'll say, I'll leave it at that. If you spend any significant chunk of time learning about the Holocaust, learning about the rise of Nazi fascism, you are going to see our country and current politics and policy in a way that you cannot unsee. I don't know how else to put it. That lens is with me now. And boy, is it scary to live with. but I almost feel like slightly ashamed that I didn't have it before.
But I also think you just explained why some of our elected officials aren't so big on history and don't want our children to learn this stuff. Because some of them are mimicking a playbook that's been used in history. And if people knew it and saw it for what it was and what it is, they'd have something to say about it. So, yeah, I think ignorance is their friend.
I'm taking a look at the time. I have 2 more clips I've pulled out, and I just don't think we have time for both of them.
Keep going. We'll be fine.
So I'm making a tough call on the fly right now.
Not going anywhere.
Okay, so we're going to switch gears. We're still talking about memorials, but we're going to step back from the Stolperstein for a moment, which is this very small, personal thing, to a much larger thing. My words are failing me here, which is the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. It's in the heart of Berlin. It is huge, about 5 acres. And I give you this vision to sort of set you up for this next audio clip. It's right in the heart of downtown Berlin. It is this maze of cement pillars, and the ground kind of slopes down, and you walk into it and they rise around you, and it's very disorienting. And one of the things that I did when I set out to learn about memorials and memorialization was learn some of the politics. We talk about political leaders of getting some of this stuff built. And so kind of keep that vision in your mind of this memorial as I start this next clip. And it starts with learning some of that background, that history, and then we'll hear from Volker again. So about another 5 minutes. Opened in 2005, it took more than a decade to get institutional support for this project. Aleida Assmann is an academic and activist, and in the 90s, she was part of a small group advocating for this memorial. They sent their petition to Germany's top politician at the time, Helmut Kohl.
We sent it to Kohl, and he said, nobody in this society is interested in such a thing. You have to prove to me that there is a social demand for this.
Kohl was a conservative who led Germany through the end of the Cold War and the reunification of the country. He was a politician, often driven more by practicalities than ideologies. He sent them on a bit of a wild goose chase to collect signatures.
And he said, okay, bring me, I think, 250,000 or 500,000 Unterschriften, signatures, and I will consider the case. So then he thought he would make us quiet for a long time.
Kohl did that because he was interested in a different memorial. He was pushing for a structure elsewhere in the city that he said would honor German unity.
He made in Berlin this new wake, die Neue Wache, New Watch monument, and he declared it and dedicated it to den Opfern von Krieg und Gewaltherrschaft, to the victims of war and violent regimes.
Activists like Assmann thought that language was too vague and purposefully failed to differentiate between Germans who had lived under Nazism, including soldiers, and their victims, like Jews, who had been singled out, persecuted, murdered.
A far cry from what we wanted to install. But he made it, and it shows you how difficult it is against the top-down energy of somebody who just doesn't want it.
In the end, both memorials were created. A top Jewish leader struck a deal. He agreed to support Kohl's push for the Neue Wache Memorial, and in exchange demanded Kohl's support for the memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe.
And he said, okay, I'll leave you your monument, but you must give your consent to my monument. This is what he said. And then said, Kohl had to say, okay, it's a deal.
So in 1999, the German parliament approved the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. The government set aside almost 5 acres in the heart of Berlin. Today, it's one of the most visited sites in the city, but it's also still the subject of criticism. One German politician of the far-right AfD party denounced it as a memorial of shame. This story of memorial battles and negotiations, it's a story of dueling narratives. Narratives that aren't always settled. Negotiations that are constantly ongoing. Even in the case of Stolpersteine, says Volker Wild.
I tell you another story. There lives a tenant in our house. And he has a little office, a little real estate office, right vis-a-vis of the plaque.
That's the plaque specifically about Poldi, which had already been installed, not the Stolpersteine.
He came out of his office and I asked him, how do you like it? And now listen, he said, I'm not guilty.
Volker told him, I'm not saying you're guilty. You weren't even alive when Poldi was persecuted.
But he don't want to be bothered. Oh, what can you do? There's little you can do on stupidity, unfortunately. But he has to live with that. And the Stolperstein we install today will be right in front of his office. Yeah. So he will remember whether he wants or not.
I love that.
He will remember whether he wants to or not.
And he should. Some people don't have a choice when it comes to remembrance.
But I love the story, the backstory of that political maneuvering to get support for this big monument today that's kind of often pointed to as an example of, I don't know, like how well Germany has done. Like, look at this great memorial that they've put up and given so much space. And then to go back and learn about how it was created and learn that, you know, the politicians were dragged, right? Unwillingly into supporting it. And they made a different monument that's on another part of town that, like, no one ever goes to today. I think it just goes to show that it's not easy. It took decades.
I think people can see a genuine or distinguish a genuine memorialization from a phony one. In Richmond, as you well know, we have a reconciliation monument. It's a monument reconciliation for the slave trade that took place in Shockoe Bottom, which was the second busiest domestic slave market in the United States before the Civil War. And this monument went up, and even then, and even more so now, and Mr. Volker has radicalized me even more on this topic. I was like, reconciliation monument? When did we get to this point? And if you know Richmond, especially at this point when this monument went up years ago, was barely acknowledging that the slave trade had existed.
Okay, I want to say something. Because I was at this monument really recently, and there was a plaque there. I was with my husband, and he read it, and he was like, Mallory, come look at this. This is crazy. So the plaque that's there, this is a monument that turns out it's in 3 places, Liverpool, England, and Benin, thank you. And right at that what is it called? The Devil's Triangle? What do you call it?
It's the triangle trade.
Yeah. And the plaque says the government in England, when it accepted and put up this monument, issued a statement apologizing for its role in the slave trade, and the same thing for the government in Benin. And then 10 years, something like 10 years, I might have that number wrong, years afterwards, the Virginia General Assembly issued a statement saying they regretted that the slave trade had happened. No language of responsibility. No use of the word apology. Regret that it had happened.
Volcker says basically there is no such thing as reconciliation.
Reconciliation. The word reconciliation is the language of the oppressor. It's what the oppressor pushes on you to forget, to move on. In its application in the United States, if you look up the definition of reconciliation, it's like, well, basically two friends make up.
Justice.
Yeah.
Is there justice?
Yeah. When did that relationship ever exist between the enslaver and the enslaved? In a nation where there's been no real official apology for what happened, how do we get the point? It's like we're going to skip over the penance, we're going to skip over the apology, and we're going to kiss and make up. That's insane. It's insulting, and it's unrealistic. And so that monument to me is like a piece of propaganda in a city that still doesn't have a museum to the slave trade, or even a proper memorial to it.
Wasn't there a woman who asked you or said, I thought in Richmond, I thought in the United States, finish it.
I don't know if this is in the podcast. I think you're pulling this out of a conversation we've had. There's a woman who gave me a great tour in Berlin. She's the volunteer who works with the artist Günter Dimnig, and she does research for Stolpersteine. And we were just walking around the city. I wasn't recording anymore. We were chit-chatting. And she asked something about the slavery museum in Virginia. And I was like, that doesn't exist. She stopped, she looked at me, she goes, I thought every single state in the United States had to have a museum to slavery. Didn't John F. Kennedy do that? The Germans love John F. Kennedy.
So this was incomprehensible to her.
Incomprehensible. Absolutely.
The slave trade in the public mind's eye, slavery didn't exist in Richmond, or certainly was not spoken of in any meaningful way until the 1990s. In the former capital of the Confederacy and the second busiest domestic slave market in the country, no one spoke of it.
Okay, I want to take the pulse of the room for a second, because we got one more 4-minute clip, but it cuts into our question and answer time.
Do it. Do it. It's good. Yeah. Thank you, though.
I was so lucky to be there the day these Stolpersteine were installed. And it was an amazing experience, not least of which because I got to see and meet Günter Dimnig in person. We had talked over Zoom, but it was the first round of installations that he did post-COVID. Paper and mic. So, let's listen to that. Which brings us to a beautiful August afternoon in Berlin, as Volker Wild and a small crowd watch the artist Günter Dimnig install a set of small stones into the sidewalk outside the apartment building in Prenzlauer Berg. Quickly, efficiently, Dimnig kneels down and pulls up parts of the existing sidewalk. In the empty space, he settles in 6 shiny brass plaque Stolpersteine. Hier wohnte, here lived, Leopold Poldy Jones, reads one. Born 1924, forced labor, 1943. Deported, October 29th, 1943. Killed in Auschwitz. With a brush, Dimnig softly wipes away the dirt, giving them a final tap around the edges. In a matter of minutes, it's done. Dimnig loads up his equipment and rolls out onto the next set of stones and installation elsewhere in the city. Volker takes me inside to show me the building he fell in love with so long ago.
So the house was built in 1876.
We head up a big stairwell with tall ceilings. So, in all the research, do you know where they lived? The victims?
The parents of Polly would live here.
Really, this apartment?
Yeah.
We're right outside the door. We knock, but no one answers.
But it must be no one is in.
Yeah. Can I ask one question? What does it mean? What's the power in knowing the history of the place of the building?
What does it mean? Well, it is. Well, I don't quite know what you are expecting me to answer. But certainly the answer is not that each time I walk the stairs, I say to myself, well, this is the flat of so-and-so.
At each turn in the long stairwell, Volker stops, though, as if something new has occurred to him he wants to add.
Many people think we should stop talking about it. They believed, let's go forward, let's talk about future. Yes, one might go ahead. As I said to you, there is no one who could forgive. There will be no release from this history. It doesn't happen. Many people tried.
Hallo.
I never really get to hear the end of that thought, because we're interrupted by a young woman moving into one of the units in the building. Life goes on. Volker and I step back into the courtyard, then out onto the street. We pause to take a photo of the newly gleaming brass stones. There's a small bouquet of yellow and white flowers someone has already placed beside them. Something I love about Stolperstein is that it allows two people who didn't know each other, who seemingly may not be directly connected, to form a connection. It makes this very terrible, hard thing real to someone living today. Volker didn't know Poldy. They didn't live. They were never alive at the same time. But they did live in the same place. And there is a connection. And the stone makes that real.
Every time I hear the end of that, I want to tear up.
I don't think
Because
because to be remembered is just so essential, or desire to be remembered is just, I think, so essential to our being. It's what connects us through the generations, through the centuries. I think it gives life meaning. The people came before, people to come after, the people suffered, the people survived. I think it's terribly meaningful, and just that stumbling stone, and then the fact that someone almost immediately acknowledged it. I think it's
And yet
reassuring.
And yet that project didn't happen right after World War II. I mean, you're talking about almost 50 years. Let's remember that at the end of World War II, it was the occupying US forces that forced a value system on the Germans not to forget. And that very military occupational don't forget was coming out of the context of a Jim Crow in our own country.
Yep.
So how do you...
We talk about that in the podcast, that the US government and military were imposing a value system on Germany, hypocritically, that we never lived up to at home in dealing with our own atrocities over the centuries. We abandoned that concept in the Reconstruction era after the Civil War in the name of reconciliation. So it's just terribly ironic to me that.
But also unwilling Germans. I don't want anyone to necessarily walk away with the idea that the German society of today is on a pedestal with what they've done. A lot of unwilling Germans.
Right, to this day. Does policy force a new kind of sensitivity within a society towards facing its own past? Is it governmental policy that pushes this?
Mm-hmm.
I think those things occur and are most effective when they spring up from the grassroots. I mean, just thinking of our own human rights movements in the United States, they've always been grassroots-driven efforts that elected officials eventually support. But I don't think of the politicians as the leaders there. In Richmond, when it came to the Confederate monuments, the leaders were not the politicians. People, like with the stumbling stones, kind of took matters into their own hands.
But I don't know that it has to be an either or sort of thing, though. Like, both examples of the memorialization that we talked about tonight were grassroots efforts. But it also isn't such a bad thing that the policy is in place that you can't put a swastika out.
Oh.
Right? That's
Wish
illegal.
we had something like that.
So policy can really help. We choose to enact it.
It also raises interesting questions about freedom and what freedom means, and whether the tug of war between freedom and responsibility. Our freedoms here in the United States allow certain expressions of hate that I think are permitted elsewhere. And that's the path that we've chosen. But you need a responsible citizenry to make that work.
Should we hear from folks? Bob's the fearless leader. He decides.
We have a few minutes. A question is a question. It's not a proclamation. It's not a statement of your belief. It's a question for these two people. So if you'd like to expand a question, please raise your hand. Go ahead.
One thing that really struck me.
Can you hear back there? Loud.
one thing that struck me is the difference in the challenges in Germany from our country. And just out of curiosity, I Googled the other day, what is the Jewish population in Germany? And the number I heard that I saw on my little Google thing was 200,000 people.
I think it's 0.6% of the population, something like that.
Very, very small. And so, in essence, it seems like Germany, it is not, we know anti-Semitism is dead, but it's not the ongoing problem that we have today. You addressed that. The differences between the challenges we have as we see the racism still so active.
That's a fantastic point that I wish I had made more clear in the body of work, is just how small the Jewish population is in Germany today. And then, of course, after the war, non-existent. They had been effectively murdered. And chased away. And so certainly, right, this rebuilding happened in an environment where Germans weren't face to face with those they had persecuted every day, which is very different than the United States. Absolutely.
Would the closest, I mean, not by what happened, but or the nature of what happened, but would the closest approximation here be Native Americans?
Yeah. I mean, a genocide.
A genocide.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer to the question except that it's a really great point and a really significant difference that poses a challenge. And also, I hope it poses a challenge only in so much as people and institutions are still racist. Right? The challenge, I want to be very clear, the challenge isn't the existence of Black Americans. The challenge is that racism exists against those Black Americans, because that community, I think all we have to do is look at the civil rights movement and the history to show the imperative role they've played, but in expanding
And moving.
freedoms,
And,
right?
and it takes time. Question.
I was just wondering, the unwilling Germans that you mentioned today that are willing to face and deal with, what do they face, their reason for doing that? I mean, it's been so documented what happened. No reason. Like, what would they face any rationale for not facing it?
The question was, on what basis, on what kind of rationale do the unwilling Germans not accept responsibility in a sense of their own history?
After that, asked about unwilling Americans.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know that there is a rationale, right? It's not a rational thing. The far-right party in Germany today, I think you sort of get an example of it, right? The leader points to this memorial as the memorial of shame. And you hear the same things, I think, that you hear here. It's time to move on, right? It's happened. It's in the past. It's time to move on. Yeah. Which is one step away from, there's just straight up Holocaust denial, right? Which is a whole thing in and of itself. And then there's the one step removed from that, which is, yes, it happened, but it's been so long.
But if you acknowledge it and accept responsibility for that history, the history requires something of you. And some people are unwilling to put in that work. It's not to say you are at fault, but if you are part of a state that committed this horrible atrocity, or there's a collective societal guilt that has to be dealt with, has to be acknowledged. And
Do we have a societal guilt
In the U.S.
about our own U.S. past?
I don't know. No, it's all we don't. There's a big debate now. One of the jurisdictions in Virginia, I believe, was the Isle of Wight,
Uh-huh.
has declared that systemic racism is not a thing, which is insane, right? But but
Americans don't have guilt, they have pride.
yeah.
But isn't there, can't you have pride and guilt? Guilt can be part of that pride.
That's a very nuanced thing that I think is lost a number of people.
Yeah. One last question.
Well, a question and a statement. I'd like to thank you for your collaboration. But I think one of the most important and impressive pieces of journalism in a long time would be NPR extended range, but for Mr. Williams, when we talk about the 5 acres in Berlin, can you talk about Chocolate Bottom, the gas station, and the burial ground? Is there a possibility of doing something as significant there as what they did in Berlin?
Well, let's put this in a certain perspective.
Can you first, for those who don't know what we're talking about?
Yeah. We have, and they kind of get confused, but we have Shackle Bottom. I don't know how familiar you are with the geography of Richmond, but there's Shackle Bottom, where the auction houses and the most notorious slave jail, Lumpkin's jail, and all of that existed. It was the epicenter of the selling and buying of human beings. And adjacent to that was a gallows and then a massive graveyard called the African Burying Ground. When that apparently outlived its usefulness, another cemetery was created for free and enslaved Black people on what was called Shackle Hill. Both of them have been effectively destroyed. The African Burying Ground, and I've lived in Richmond all my life, I was unaware of its existence. All that sits on the site now is an abandoned filling station, gas station. I mean, there are generations of young people in here that probably don't recall what a filling station was, where someone actually came out and pumped your gas for you and checked your oil and wiped your windshield. But yeah, that thing's been abandoned as long as I
Only
can
in New
remember.
Jersey.
Yeah. And that history's only recently been unearthed, thanks to a descendant who came here to go to a gravesite of her relative and was astonished to see there was no evidence of a gravesite there, only this filling station. They built Interstate 95 over all of this. In Shackle Bottom, they built a train station. In the midst of construction, around the burying ground in Shackle Hill, they used crushed bodies basically as construction fill once they unearthed them. I mean, it's just desecration taken to its nth degree. And so we're just getting to the point where we're acknowledging this history. Just put up a historical sign, I think last year, was it? This year, last year?
I think maybe 2 years ago.
2 years.
This year, it was just thanks to that descendant's dogged work, was added to the National Register of Historic Places.
Yeah. So we're just getting to the point where we're even acknowledging and documenting the history and trying to do something about it. Hundreds of years. I mean, Germany looks progressive in that regard, in erecting the monument to murdered Jews. 50 years later? How many years later?
Yeah, that's right.
So it's awful. I mean, what we haven't done to acknowledge what happened here.
If I have a short story that I want to tell that I think will just wrap everything up really nicely. Because it has to do with the history that Michael is talking about, as well as what we've been talking about when it comes to education and children, and not shielding them, i.e. shielding us. I had a fantastic opportunity presented to me by a fantastic teacher to come into 8th grade English classes to talk about this material. And we talked about Volker's story and the Stolperstein, and I ended this presentation with 8th grade English students in Henrico County with a photo of the site, right? Grass, gas station, highway. Asked them if anyone knew what it was, and I told them, we talked about it. They learned, what you guys just learned from Michael. And one kid said, "This is why I never step on grass." And another kid raised their hand and asked, why did they do that? Why did they build a highway over it? And another kid raised their hand to comment and said, that was really wrong.
And I would have answered, why do they throw the bodies in the river? I mean, it's a crime scene. And you build stuff over to conceal the scene of the crime.
But the kids got it. There was no hedging, right? They saw what was presented to them, and they knew it was wrong.
And
I hate this.
I just want to get it on the record, at least from my perspective. I don't have anywhere to go. I can stay here. So if you all want to leave, that's fine. But it's not because of me.
As a teacher, you always are reading the kids' faces in their eyes, and I hope that when you look out there, these people are riveted, and there's a reason for it. In broadcasting lingo, that's a wrap. Okay. Now, tonight's program asks more questions than it provides answers. And that's the way it's supposed to be. We have a lot to ponder. And if you have not listened to the entire 6-episode of Memory Wars, please do so. I urge you to do so. And it is available in quite a few different locations. I want to thank you, Mallory and Michael, for helping us to explore crucial topics of concern. And for all of you, thank you. And everyone, safe travels home.